The orbital station Nexus Prime hung like a metallic spider in the void, its countless arms reaching out to dock ships from across the galaxy. Commander Jake Morrison stepped off the transport, his worn military boots echoing against the polished deck plating. The familiar weight of his service rifle felt reassuring against his back, even though weapons were supposedly unnecessary in this neutral zone. Around him, beings from dozens of species moved through the station's corridors. Tall, elegant Valethians with their crystalline skin caught the artificial light and scattered rainbows across the walls. Heavily armored Krog merchants lumbered past, their massive frames making the deck vibrate with each step. Ethereal whisperfolk drifted through the air, their translucent forms barely visible except for the soft blue glow they emitted. Jake had been fighting in the Outer Rim conflicts for 3 years now. What had started as a simple territorial dispute had escalated into a brutal war that consumed entire star systems. Humanity had proven themselves formidable warriors, their tactical flexibility and stubborn refusal to surrender earning both respect and fear among the galactic community. But the cost had been enormous. The summons to Nexus Prime had come as a surprise. The Galactic Arbitration Council rarely involved itself in regional conflicts, preferring to let smaller species sort out their differences while the major powers watched from the sidelines. Yet here he was, one of 12 human representatives called to what the message had described as final negotiations. The conference chamber was a marvel of engineering, a vast spherical room with transparent walls that offered a stunning view of the nebula beyond. Floating platforms accommodated delegates from various species, each adjusted for their specific environmental needs. The humans were given a section with standard gravity and atmosphere, though Jake noticed they were positioned somewhat apart from the main cluster of platforms. Admiral Chen, the senior human representative, briefed them quickly. The Arbitration Council has proposed a ceasefire, she explained, her weathered face showing the strain of years of command. They're offering what they call compensation packages for each side to withdraw from contested territories. What kind of compensation? Asked Lieutenant Torres, Jake's former squad mate. That's where it gets interesting, Chen replied. Each delegation gets to choose from a selection of prizes. Advanced technology, resource rights, even entire uninhabited worlds. The council seems to think they can buy us off. Jake frowned. And, if we refuse? Then, they classify this as a threat to galactic stability and authorize intervention. Chen's expression was grim. Which means facing the combined fleets of the council races. We've proven we can fight, but, those odds. The implications hung heavy in the air. Humanity had come far since first contact, but, they were still newcomers to galactic politics. The established powers had resources and alliances built over millennia. The formal session began an hour later. The chamber filled with delegates from both sides of the conflict, along with representatives from the council races. Chancellor Vextar of the Hegemony Alliance spoke first, his serpentine form coiled on an elevated platform. Honored arbiters, he began, his translator rendering his hissing speech into perfect galactic standard, we come seeking justice for the unprovoked aggression committed by these, humans. Their expansion into sacred hegemony space cannot stand. Admiral Chen stood to respond. The colonies in question were established on uninhabited worlds. No prior claims were registered with any recognized authority. Humanity has every right to expand within unoccupied space. The arguments continued for hours, covering the same ground that had been fought over both in council chambers and on battlefields. Jake found his attention wandering, studying the various aliens present. Most were familiar, the major players in galactic politics who had shaped policy for centuries. Then, he noticed her. She sat in a corner section, partially hidden behind a structural support beam. Where the other delegates occupied prominent positions with elaborate seating arrangements, she had what appeared to be a simple metal chair. No retinue, no ceremonial guards, no impressive technological displays. Just a young alien woman, at least, she appeared female by human standards, sitting quietly and watching the proceedings. She was humanoid in basic structure but, clearly not human. Her skin had a pale blue-silver tone that seemed to shift slightly in the chamber's changing light. Large, dark eyes dominated her delicate features, and what appeared to be gill slits along her neck suggested an aquatic origin. Her clothing was simple, almost utilitarian compared to the ornate robes and armor worn by other delegates. What struck Jake most was how completely she was being ignored. Other delegates talked and gestured animatedly, building alliances and making deals. But no one approached her section. No one even seemed to acknowledge her presence. She might as well have been furniture. During a recess, Jake made his way over to Admiral Chen. "Who's the woman in the corner?" "The blue-skinned one." Chen followed his gaze and shrugged. "Hydran representative, I think. Their species is practically extinct. Maybe a dozen worlds left, and most of those are barely habitable. They don't have much influence in council politics. Why is she here? Probably required for some procedural reason. The Hydrans have observer status in a few committees. But, honestly, I'm not sure anyone cares what they think." Jake looked back at the isolated figure. She was reading something on a small tablet, occasionally glancing up at the main proceedings. There was something about her posture, not defeated, but resigned. Like someone who had learned not to expect much from the universe. The negotiations resumed with increasingly complex proposals. The Hegemony Alliance offered humanity 3 different compensation packages: advanced shield technology, exclusive mining rights to a cluster of resource-rich asteroids, or territorial concessions in a different sector entirely. "Generous offers," Chancellor Vextar said, though his tone suggested he found them anything but. Surely reasonable beings can find acceptable terms among these options. Admiral Chen requested a recess to discuss the proposals with her team. As the various delegations broke into smaller groups, Jake found himself walking toward the Hydran representative section. Up close, she was even more striking. Her features were delicate but not fragile, and those large dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to take in everything around her. When she noticed his approach, she looked up with surprise. "Commander Morrison," she said, her English accent suggesting she had studied human languages. "I am surprised to see you here. You know who I am." "Your actions at the Battle of Kepler's Gate are well documented," she replied. "The way you held position against overwhelming odds while evacuating civilian transports was impressive." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Just doing my job." "I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "Lyra Thane 6, representing what remains of the Hydran Collective." She gestured to the empty space around her platform. "Though as you can see, it is a rather symbolic representation." "Why are you here alone? Don't most species send entire delegations to these things?" A sad smile crossed her features. "When your entire government can fit in a single conference room, large delegations become impractical. I am here because the treaties require Hydran presence at certain proceedings, not because anyone expects us to contribute meaningfully." Jake sat on the edge of her platform, ignoring the stares from other delegates. "What happened to your people?" "The same thing that happens to many species who fail to adapt quickly enough," Lyra replied. "We were explorers, scientists, artists. When the galaxy became more competitive, we lacked the military strength or economic power to maintain our position. Our colonies were gradually absorbed by larger empires. Our trade routes were taken over by more aggressive species. Now we exist at the sufferance of others. That's..." Jake searched for words. "That's terrible. It is the way of things. The strong prosper, the weak endure what they must. Your species understands this truth better than most." Jake studied her face. There was no bitterness in her voice, just acceptance of harsh reality. "What will you choose? When they offer the compensation packages?" Lyra's laugh was soft but hollow. "Commander, did you not hear Chancellor Vextar's offer? 3 packages, for the human delegation to choose from. The Hydrons are not part of this conflict. We are simply present. The casual dismissal in those words hit Jake like a physical blow. Here was an entire species, reduced to observing while others decided the fate of worlds they might never see. And everyone just accepted it as normal. That's not right, he said. Many things are not right, Commander. But protest rarely changes them. The session reconvened, and Jake returned to the human section with a growing sense of unease. The compensation offers were indeed impressive. The shield technology alone would give human ships a significant advantage in future conflicts. The mining rights represented enormous economic potential. The territorial concessions would provide strategic depth for human expansion. But, as the discussions continued, Jake kept glancing back at Lyra's isolated platform. She took notes occasionally, but otherwise remained silent. A living symbol of how quickly a species could fall from relevance to irrelevance in galactic politics. Admiral Chen was leaning toward accepting the shield technology. It would give humanity an edge that could prevent future conflicts, or at least tip the odds in their favor. The other team members agreed, pointing out the long-term strategic benefits. The shields will save human lives, Lieutenant Torres argued. We have a responsibility to our people. And the technology could be adapted for civilian use, added Dr. Yamamoto, their scientific advisor. Energy barriers for colony worlds, improved spacecraft hulls. The applications are endless. Jake listened to the arguments, but his mind kept returning to the conversation with Lyra. The casual acceptance of powerlessness. The resignation to being forgotten while others shaped the galaxy's future. As the session moved toward final decisions, Chancellor Vextar rose once again. The Arbitration Council requires formal acceptance of compensation terms by each delegation. Human representatives, what is your choice? Admiral Chen stood, prepared to announce their decision. But, Jake surprised everyone, including himself, by speaking first. I request clarification on the compensation process. Chen shot him a sharp look, but protocol required that questions be answered. Chancellor Vextar's expression showed mild annoyance at the delay. The process is simple, Commander. Each delegation chooses from the available options appropriate to their status in these negotiations. And who determines that status? Jake asked. The status is obvious, Vextar replied with a dismissive gesture. Primary parties to the conflict receive primary consideration. Observer species receive appropriate acknowledgement. Jake stood, feeling the weight of every gaze in the chamber. What if a primary party chooses to transfer their compensation to an observer? The chamber fell silent. Admiral Chen's face had gone pale, but she didn't countermand him. Chancellor Vextar's serpentine features twisted in confusion. That would be highly irregular, the Chancellor said finally. The compensation is intended to resolve specific conflicts between specific parties. But, not prohibited. Jake pressed. One of the council arbiters, an elderly Zephyrin whose species had mediated disputes for millennia, leaned forward with interest. The protocols do not explicitly forbid such transfers, she said slowly. Though the precedent would be unprecedented. Jake looked across the chamber at Lyra, who was staring at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Then, he turned back to the assembled delegates. Then, I formally request that the human delegation transfer our compensation rights to the Hydron representative. The chamber erupted in voices speaking dozens of languages. Admiral Chen grabbed his arm, but Jake continued speaking. The Hydron collective has been ignored and dismissed despite their obvious intelligence and peaceful nature. If this council truly seeks justice rather than mere expediency, then, perhaps it's time someone chose to lift up the forgotten instead of simply taking what benefits themselves. Chancellor Vextar's voice cut through the chaos. This is absurd. The human delegation cannot simply give away compensation meant to resolve their own territorial disputes. But, the elderly Zephyrin arbiter was nodding slowly. Actually, she said, from a legal standpoint, the compensation belongs to the recipients to dispose of as they see fit. If they choose to transfer it. The implications rippled through the chamber. The Hegemony Alliance delegates were frantically conferring among themselves. Giving humanity any significant compensation had been difficult enough for their pride. But, now that compensation would go to a species they had written off as irrelevant. Jake caught Admiral Chen's eye. She looked furious, but also thoughtful. After a moment, she nodded slightly. The human delegation supports Commander Morrison's request, she announced. We transfer our compensation rights to Representative Thane 6 and the Hydron Collective. Lyra was on her feet now, her composed demeanor finally cracking. This is. Commander, do you understand what you are doing? These choices could transform your species' position in the galaxy. I understand exactly what I'm doing, Jake replied. I'm choosing to believe that strength isn't just about taking what you can get. Sometimes it's about lifting up those who've been pushed down. The debate that followed lasted hours. The hegemony delegates tried every legal and procedural maneuver to block the transfer. But, the council arbiters, perhaps intrigued by the unprecedented nature of the gesture, ultimately ruled that the transfer was permissible under existing protocols. As the session finally adjourned, Jake found himself surrounded by his fellow humans. Some looked angry, others confused. But, Admiral Chen just studied his face carefully. You realize what you've just done? She asked quietly. I gave compensation to someone who needed it more than we did, Jake replied. You've turned galactic politics on its head, Chen said. Every species is going to be asking why humans chose to elevate the Hydrons instead of ourselves. Some will think we're weak. Others will think we're dangerously unpredictable. And, what do you think? Admiral Chen smiled for the first time in weeks. I think, she said slowly, that we just reminded everyone what makes humans dangerous isn't our weapons or our tactics. It's that we don't play by anyone else's rules when those rules are wrong. As the chamber emptied, Jake made his way back to Lyra's platform. She was standing perfectly still, staring at the compensation documents that had been transferred to her name. Documents that represented technology, resources, and opportunities her species hadn't seen in generations. Why? She asked simply as he approached. Jake thought about the question, about the battles he'd fought and the friends he'd lost. About the choice between taking what was offered and doing what felt right. Because someone had to, he said finally. And, because I think your people have something the galaxy needs more than we need better shields or mining rights. What could we possibly have that the mighty human species needs? Hope, Jake replied. Hope that there's still room in this galaxy for species who choose exploration over conquest, science over warfare, cooperation over domination. If we just let that disappear because it's not profitable or strategic, then, what does that make us? Lyra looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting depths of emotion he couldn't read. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You may have just saved my entire species from extinction, Commander Morrison. That is not a debt easily repaid. Then, don't try to repay it, Jake said. Just, use what we've given you to prove that there's still room in this galaxy for people who believe in something better than survival of the fittest. As they stood together in the emptying chamber, looking out at the stars beyond the transparent walls, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. Not just for the Hydrons, or for humanity, but for the entire balance of power in the galaxy. He had no idea how right he was. 6 months after the Nexus Prime negotiations, the galaxy was buzzing with confusion and speculation. The Hydron Collective, written off by most species as a dying civilization, had suddenly emerged as a significant player in galactic affairs. The compensation package humanity had transferred to them included exclusive mining rights to the Kepler asteroid field, one of the richest sources of rare minerals in known space. But, it wasn't the economic implications that had everyone talking. It was what the Hydrons were doing with their newfound resources. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the human cruiser Defiance, watching the construction activity around the massive asteroid designated Kepler-7. Where most species would have established mining platforms and processing facilities, the Hydrons were building something entirely different. "Still can't believe what I'm seeing," said Lieutenant Torres, joining Jake at the viewport. "It's like they're turning that rock into a city." Jake nodded, studying the elegant spires and curved walkways that seemed to grow organically from the asteroid's surface. Hydron architecture was unlike anything else in the galaxy, flowing and graceful where other species favored harsh angles and imposing geometry. Even their industrial facilities looked more like art installations than factories. "Admiral Chen wants to see you," Torres added. "She just received another communication from the Galactic Council. Apparently, everyone wants to know what humanity's angle is in all this." Jake made his way to the Admiral's ready room, where he found Chen reviewing reports on her holographic display. Charts and graphs showed the rapid expansion of Hydron operations throughout the Kepler system, along with intelligence estimates from various species trying to understand what was happening. "Sit down, Commander," Chen said without looking up. "We need to talk." Jake settled into a chair, noting the tension in his superior's posture. "Problems?" "That depends on your perspective," Chen replied, finally, meeting his gaze. "The Hydrons have made contact with over 40 different species in the past 6 months. Minor species, mostly. The ones who usually get ignored in galactic politics." "That sounds positive." "It would be, if half the major powers weren't convinced we're orchestrating some kind of elaborate conspiracy." Chen activated a new display showing communication intercepts and diplomatic traffic. "The Hegemony Alliance thinks we're using the Hydrons as a front to build a coalition against them. The Krog Trade Federation is worried we're undermining their economic dominance. Even the Ethereal Conclave is asking questions." Jake studied the data streaming across the display. "What's our official position?" "That we made a gesture of goodwill and have no direct involvement in Hydron activities," Chen replied. "But, between you and me, that's becoming harder to maintain." She gestured to another display showing a detailed report from their intelligence division. Jake's eyes widened as he read the summary. "They're sharing technology?" he asked incredulously. "Not just sharing. Teaching." Chen's expression was grim. "The Hydrons have opened what they're calling cooperative research facilities throughout their new territories. They're working with species that most major powers consider beneath notice, helping them develop infrastructure, advance their science, improve their quality of life." Jake leaned back in his chair. "And, the major powers don't like that." "The major powers are terrified," Chen corrected. "For millennia, galactic politics has been based on a careful hierarchy. The strong dominate, the weak survive on scraps, and everyone knows their place. Now suddenly, species that were barely surviving are developing advanced technologies and forming mutual defense pacts." Mutual defense pacts. Chen activated another display showing a map of the galaxy with various species' territories highlighted in different colors. Jake noticed that many of the smaller territories were now connected by dotted lines indicating alliance agreements. "The Hydrons aren't just helping with technology," Chen explained. "They're facilitating diplomatic connections between species that never had the resources to interact before. The singing crystals of harmony are now sharing their unique acoustic technologies with the silicon builders of Petra-9. The reef tenders are collaborating with the cloud dancers on atmospheric engineering projects." "That sounds like exactly what the galaxy needs," Jake said. "I agree. But, try explaining that to Chancellor Vextar." Chen pulled up a recording of the Hegemony Alliance's latest diplomatic protest. The serpentine aliens translated words dripped with barely contained fury. "The humans claim innocence, but their fingerprints are all over this disruption," Vextar hissed. "They elevate a dying species to prominence, then stand back while that species undermines the natural order of galactic civilization. This cannot be coincidence. Jake watched the recording with growing unease. He really believes we planned this. The scary part is, some of our own people are starting to believe it too, Chen said. There's a faction in command that thinks you made a brilliant strategic move. They want to take credit for destabilizing the existing power structure. But, that's not what happened. I know that. You know that. But, perception is becoming reality. Chen leaned forward across her desk. Which brings me to why you're here. The Hydrons have requested a meeting with you specifically. Personal invitation from Representative Thane 6. Jake felt his pulse quicken. He hadn't spoken with Lyra since the negotiations at Nexus Prime, though he'd followed news of her activities with growing amazement. In 6 months, she had transformed from an ignored observer to one of the most influential figures in galactic politics. What does she want? Unknown. But, Jake. Chen's expression became serious. Whatever she's planning, it's big. Our intelligence suggests the Hydrons are preparing for some kind of major announcement. Multiple species have been sending delegations to their facilities. And, there are rumors about something called the Restoration Project. Restoration of what? That's what we need to find out. 2 days later, Jake found himself aboard a small diplomatic shuttle approaching the main Hydron facility at Kepler 7. As they drew closer, he could see that his first impressions from a distance hadn't done justice to what the Hydrons had built. The asteroid had been completely transformed. Where before there had been bare rock and ice, now there were vast domed structures that gleamed like pearls in the starlight. Gardens visible through transparent walls showed that the Hydrons had created a complete ecosystem within their installations. And, everywhere, beings from dozens of different species moved through graceful corridors and worked side by side in research facilities. The shuttle docked at what appeared to be a reception area designed to accommodate wildly different physiologies. Jake saw atmospheric processors configured for methane-breathing frostkin working alongside water tanks for aquatic species and high-gravity chambers for the rock-like mineral lords. Lyra was waiting for him in a chamber with standard human-compatible atmosphere. She looked different than he remembered, more confident, more purposeful. Her simple clothing had been replaced with elegant robes that seemed to shift color as she moved, and she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had grown into a position of real authority. Commander Morrison, she said, offering a gesture that he recognized as a Hydron greeting of deep respect. Thank you for coming. It's good to see you again, Jake replied honestly. Though I have to say, you've been busy. Lyra smiled, and Jake noticed that some of the sadness that had marked her features at Nexus Prime was gone. The opportunities your gift provided have been overwhelming. Would you like to see what we've accomplished? She led him through corridors that seemed to pulse with life. The walls themselves were grown rather than built, using some kind of bioarchitectural technique that created living spaces that adapted to their inhabitants' needs. They passed laboratories where beings that had never met before their species' first contact were collaborating on projects that combined their unique abilities in unprecedented ways. This is incredible, Jake said, watching a team of researchers that included crystalline harmony, gaseous nebulakin, and silicon-based petrobuilders working together on what appeared to be a new type of energy storage system. It is only the beginning, Lyra replied. But, first, there is something I must show you. Something that will help you understand why your choice at Nexus Prime was more significant than either of us realized. She led him to a secured area deeper in the facility, past chambers that hummed with advanced technology and research activities Jake couldn't begin to identify. Finally, they reached a vast circular room with a holographic display at its center that showed a three-dimensional map of the galaxy. But, this wasn't like any galactic map Jake had seen before. Instead of political boundaries and territorial claims, it showed networks of connection and interaction. Lines of light flowed between star systems, pulsing with different colors and intensities. What am I looking at? Jake asked. The true state of galactic civilization, Lyra replied, manipulating the display to zoom in on different regions. The red lines represent military dominance relationships, who can force whom to comply through threat of violence. The yellow lines show economic dependencies, who controls essential resources or trade routes. And, the blue lines. The blue lines were sparse, mostly concentrated around the territories of major powers. What do blue lines represent? Voluntary cooperation. Mutual benefit without coercion. Knowledge sharing without exploitation. Lyra's voice carried a note of sadness. As you can see, true cooperation is rare in our galaxy. Jake studied the display, noting how the vast majority of connections between star systems were red or yellow. So most relationships are based on force or economic pressure. Precisely. The major powers maintain their positions by ensuring that smaller species remain dependent and isolated. They prevent the formation of cooperative networks that might challenge the existing hierarchy. Lyra manipulated the display again, showing the same map but, with a time overlay. This shows the galaxy 100 years ago. The difference was striking. A century ago, there had been far more blue lines scattered throughout the galaxy. Entire regions showed networks of cooperative relationships between species that seem to have vanished in the present day. What happened? The Great Convergence, Lyra explained. A period when the major powers systematically eliminated or absorbed smaller civilizations that might pose challenges to their dominance. My own species barely survived that era. She changed the display again, this time showing projected trends. If current patterns continue, within another century there will be perhaps 5 major powers controlling the entire galaxy. All others will be client species or extinct. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Unless something changes the pattern. Unless someone demonstrates that there is another way. Lyra met his gaze directly. Your choice at Nexus Prime was the first time in decades that a major power voluntarily elevated a weaker species without seeking to control them. It broke the pattern, if only briefly. Jake studied the current map again, noticing something he had missed before. Around the Hydran territories, new blue lines were beginning to appear. Small networks of cooperation spreading outward from their facilities. You're trying to recreate those old cooperative networks, he said. We are doing more than trying, Commander. We are succeeding. Lyra activated a new display showing the results of the past 6 months. 47 species have joined our cooperative research programs. 12 mutual defense pacts have been signed. Trade agreements based on fair exchange rather than exploitation are replacing the old dependency relationships. And, the major powers are getting nervous. Terrified would be more accurate. Lyra's expression became serious. Which brings me to why I asked you here. What we have built so far is impressive, but it is not sustainable without continued support from humanity. Jake felt a chill of apprehension. What kind of support? The kind that will make it clear to the galaxy that humanity stands behind the principle of cooperative civilization rather than domination. Lyra gestured to another display showing military force deployments throughout the galaxy. The Hegemony Alliance is massing fleets near our borders. They claim it is a routine training exercise, but our intelligence suggests they are preparing to take direct action against our facilities. They wouldn't dare attack neutral research stations. They would if they believed humanity would not respond, Lyra replied. Your species' reputation for protecting your allies is well established. But, we are not officially your allies. We are simply the beneficiaries of your generosity. Jake began to understand the impossible position the Hydrans were in. They had used humanity's gift to build something remarkable, but, without formal protection, they were vulnerable to retaliation from the established powers. What exactly are you asking for? A choice, Lyra said simply. Your government must decide whether the vision of cooperative civilization we are building is worth defending, or whether humanity prefers to maintain its position within the existing order. She activated a final display showing 2 possible futures. In one, the Hydron cooperative networks continued to spread, eventually encompassing much of the galaxy in relationships based on mutual benefit rather than domination. In the other, the major powers crushed the emerging cooperation and solidified their control over an increasingly stratified and repressive galactic order. If we choose to support you openly, we risk war with the Hegemony Alliance and their allies, Jake said. Yes. But, if you choose to abandon us, you risk something far worse. Lyra's voice carried absolute conviction. You risk watching the galaxy slide into an age of permanent oppression, where no species will ever again have the chance to rise above their designated place in the hierarchy. Jake stared at the displays, understanding now why Admiral Chen had seemed so troubled. The choice Lyra was presenting wasn't just about military alliances or political strategy. It was about the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. There's something else, Lyra continued. The project we have been working toward, the one your people's intelligence has detected, is nearly ready. The Restoration Project? A network of research stations and cooperative facilities that will span a significant portion of the galaxy. Self-sustaining, defensible, and dedicated to the principle that all sapient species deserve the opportunity to develop their potential. Lyra's eyes shone with an intensity Jake had never seen before. We call it the Restoration Project because we are restoring the galaxy to what it was meant to be, a community of diverse civilizations working together rather than a hierarchy of predators and prey. When will it be ready? Within the month. But, the moment we announce its existence, the major powers will be forced to act. They cannot allow such a network to exist, because its very presence challenges everything their authority is based on. Jake felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. 6 months ago, he had made a simple choice to help someone who had been ignored and dismissed. Now that choice had evolved into a decision that could reshape the entire galaxy. I need to speak with my superiors, he said finally. Of course. But, Commander. Lyra placed a delicate hand on his arm. Remember that some choices cannot be unmade. If humanity chooses to stand with the existing order, the opportunity for change may not come again in our lifetimes. As Jake prepared to leave Kepler-7, he carried with him the knowledge that humanity stood at a crossroads. The path they chose would determine not just their own future, but the fate of countless species throughout the galaxy. The question was whether they would have the courage to choose hope over security, cooperation over domination, and the uncertain promise of a better future over the familiar certainties of the existing order. The emergency session of the Human Defense Council convened in the deepest levels of Luna Station, far beneath the moon's surface where no electronic surveillance could penetrate. Around the oval table sat the most powerful figures in human space, Admiral Chen, General Rodriguez from Colonial Defense, Director Hayes from Intelligence, and President Williams herself. Jake Morrison sat at the far end of the table, feeling distinctly out of place among the titans of human leadership. He had delivered his report on the Hydron situation 3 hours ago, and the debate that followed had grown increasingly heated. It's a trap, General Rodriguez insisted, his scarred hands gesturing emphatically. The Hydrons build this cooperative network, we commit to defending it, and, suddenly, we're at war with half the galaxy. Meanwhile, they sit safely behind their research stations while human soldiers die for their idealistic dreams. That's an oversimplification, Director Hayes countered. Our analysis suggests the Hydra networks could provide significant strategic advantages. Access to technologies we've never seen, intelligence networks throughout unexplored regions, alliance opportunities with species that have unique capabilities. Intelligence networks built on what foundation? Rodriguez shot back. Trust. Goodwill. The moment real pressure gets applied, those fair-weather allies will abandon us faster than a ship venting atmosphere. President Williams had remained silent throughout most of the debate, her weathered features giving no indication of her thoughts. Finally, she spoke. Commander Morrison, you've been quiet during this discussion. What's your assessment of Representative Thanesik's sincerity? Jake considered the question carefully. Ma'am, I believe she's absolutely sincere about wanting to change how galactic civilization operates. Whether that change is actually achievable, that's a different question. Explain. The Hydrons have accomplished remarkable things in 6 months, but they're still fundamentally dependent on the goodwill of stronger powers. If we withdraw support, their cooperative networks collapse. If we commit fully, we risk everything on an untested model of interspecies relations. Admiral Chen leaned forward. But, you recommended we support them. I recommended we consider it, yes. Because the alternative is accepting that might makes right throughout the galaxy. That species survive or perish based solely on their military and economic power. General Rodriguez snorted dismissively. Welcome to reality, Commander. That's how the universe has always worked. Has it? Jake pulled up his tablet, displaying data from Lyra's historical analysis. According to Hydron records, galactic civilization operated very differently before the Great Convergence. Cooperative networks were common. Weaker species weren't automatically absorbed or destroyed by stronger ones. And, look how that ended, Rodriguez replied. The cooperative species got conquered by the ones willing to use force. Evolutionary pressure at work. Director Hayes studied the data Jake had shared. Actually, General, the historical pattern is more complex than that. The cooperative civilizations weren't necessarily weaker militarily. They were less willing to use preemptive force against potential threats. Which made them victims. Or, President Williams said quietly, it made them casualties of a galaxy that forgot how to choose cooperation over conquest. The room fell silent. After a moment, Williams continued. Let's examine our options systematically. First scenario, we withdraw support from the Hydrons and maintain our current position within the existing order. Consequences? Admiral Chen consulted her notes. We avoid immediate conflict with major powers. Our expansion continues at its current rate. Trade relationships remain stable. But, we also signal that our gesture at Nexus Prime was meaningless, that we'll abandon allies when convenient. Second scenario, we provide limited support. Military advisors, defensive technology sharing, perhaps a small fleet presence. That might deter immediate action against the Hydrons, Director Hayes said. But, it also commits us to a position we might not be able to sustain. Half measures tend to fail when facing determined opposition. Third scenario, full commitment. We formally ally with the Hydrons and their cooperative networks. General Rodriguez shook his head grimly. War with the Hegemony Alliance within months. Possible conflict with the Krog Federation and other major powers. We'd be facing odds that make our recent conflicts look like training exercises. Jake watched the discussion with growing frustration. The leadership was treating this as a purely strategic calculation, weighing risks and benefits without considering the broader implications. Ma'am, he said, may I offer a different perspective? Williams nodded. We're debating this as if it's a choice between safe expansion within the existing system versus risky support for an idealistic experiment. But, I think we're missing the real issue. Jake activated his tablet's display projection. The galaxy is heading toward an inevitable consolidation of power. Within a century, maybe less, there will be 3 or 4 major empires controlling everything. Every other species will be extinct or subjugated. That's been the trend for millennia, Rodriguez said. Why should we fight it? Because, Jake replied, humanity's greatest strength has never been our weapons or our technology. It's been our refusal to accept that things can't be better than they are. He changed the display to show human history. We've spent our entire existence fighting against systems that said some people were naturally superior to others. Against empires that claimed divine right to rule. Against ideologies that insisted competition and domination were the only way civilizations could function. That was different, Director Hayes said. We were fighting for human freedom and equality. Why should that principle stop at species boundaries? Jake challenged. We've seen what the hydrants can accomplish when given the opportunity. We've seen how quickly supposedly inferior species can develop when they're not being suppressed or exploited. Why would we choose to be part of a system that prevents that potential from being realized? President Williams studied the historical comparisons Jake had presented. You're arguing that this is fundamentally a moral choice rather than a strategic one. I'm arguing that the strategic choice and the moral choice are the same, ma'am. A galaxy where cooperation is possible is better for everyone, including humanity. General Rodriguez looked skeptical. That assumes the cooperative model can actually defend itself against aggressive powers. History suggests otherwise. History suggests that isolated cooperative societies can be conquered by unified aggressive ones, Jake corrected. But, what if the cooperative societies weren't isolated? What if they formed their own unified networks? Admiral Chen activated her own display, showing current military intelligence. That's exactly what the hydrants are attempting. But, Commander, their mutual defense pacts are agreements between species that barely have functional militaries. The combined fleet strength of all their allies wouldn't match a single hegemony battle group. Right now, Jake agreed. But, what about after they've had time to develop? What about after they've shared technologies and training methods? What about after they've proven that species don't have to choose between cooperation and strength? Director Hayes leaned back in his chair. You're talking about a complete transformation of galactic political structure. The kind of change that takes centuries, not years. Maybe. Or maybe it takes one clear example that a different way is possible. President Williams called for a recess, and the leadership team retired to a private conference room. Jake waited in the main chamber, reviewing everything he knew about the situation and wondering if he had made a compelling case. When the session resumed an hour later, the mood in the room had changed. Williams looked as if she had aged years in the past 60 minutes. We've reached a preliminary decision, she announced. But, first, I want to hear from our intelligence division about the current threat assessment. Director Hayes activated a comprehensive display showing military movements throughout the galaxy. The situation is deteriorating rapidly. The Hegemony Alliance has moved 3 battle fleets to positions near Hydran territories. The Krog Federation is mobilizing their merchant marine, which, as we know, doubles as their auxiliary fleet. Even the Ethereal Conclave has recalled ships from patrol duties. They're coordinating? Admiral Chen asked. Our analysis suggests a loose coordination, yes. Not a formal alliance, but an understanding that the Hydra networks pose a common threat to all established powers. General Rodriguez highlighted specific fleet positions on the display. If they attack simultaneously from multiple vectors, the Hydrants can't possibly defend all their facilities. Their cooperative networks would be shattered within weeks. What's the timeline? Williams asked. Days, possibly hours, Hayes replied grimly. Our sources suggest the major powers are waiting for some kind of trigger event. The moment the Hydrants announce their restoration project, the attacks will begin. Jake felt his stomach drop. Can we warn them? Commander, Williams said, that assumes we've decided to warn them. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If humanity chose not to support the Hydrants, they could simply step aside and watch the cooperative networks be destroyed. It would be brutal, but it would eliminate the threat to galactic stability without requiring any human commitment. Ma'am, Jake said carefully, you mentioned a preliminary decision. Williams looked around the table at her advisors, then, back at Jake. We've decided that this choice is too significant to make in a closed session. We're convening an emergency session of the Colonial Congress. Representatives from every human world will debate and vote on our response. How long will that take? Admiral Chen asked. The session begins tomorrow. Emergency protocols allow for abbreviated debate procedures, but, still. Williams shrugged. At least 48 hours, probably longer. Jake stared at her in horror. Ma'am, the Hydrons don't have 48 hours. If the intelligence estimates are correct, they could be under attack within days. Then, perhaps they shouldn't announce their restoration project until our decision is finalized, Williams replied. You're asking them to delay their plans based on a decision they're not allowed to influence. I'm asking them to wait for humanity to determine its own course of action, Williams corrected. This affects every human citizen, Commander. They deserve a voice in decisions that could lead to war. Jake understood the logic, but the unfairness of it burned in his chest. The Hydrons had built something remarkable based on trust in human principles, and now those same humans were debating whether that trust had been misplaced. There is one more factor to consider, Director Hayes said. Our intelligence suggests that some members of the Hydron cooperative networks are getting impatient. Several species have begun developing more aggressive defensive capabilities. If they decide to act preemptively, the major powers would have their trigger event, Admiral Chin finished. Williams nodded grimly. Which is why we need to resolve this quickly. Commander Morrison, you'll return to Kepler-7 immediately. Inform Representative Thane 6 of our decision process and ask her to delay any major announcements until we can provide clarity on humanity's position. What if she refuses? What if the Hydrons decide they can't wait for our political process to run its course? Then, Williams said quietly, we'll discover whether the idealistic cooperation you're advocating can survive its first real test. As the session concluded, Jake felt the weight of impossible expectations. He was being asked to convince the Hydrons to risk everything on humanity's promise to eventually decide whether they were worth defending. Meanwhile, the forces arrayed against them grew stronger by the hour. On the journey back to Kepler-7, Jake reviewed everything he knew about galactic history, human nature, and the delicate networks the Hydrons had built. The math was simple and brutal. Without human support, the cooperative civilizations would be crushed. With human support, there might be a chance for something better, but the cost could be enormous. By the time his shuttle approached the Hydron facilities, Jake had reached one inescapable conclusion. The choice humanity was making wouldn't just determine the fate of the Hydrons or even the future of galactic civilization. It would answer a fundamental question about human nature. When offered the choice between security and principle, between self-interest and justice, what would they choose? The answer to that question would echo through history, regardless of which path humanity ultimately chose to walk. The emergency meeting of the Hydron Cooperative Council convened in the Grand Assembly Chamber at Kepler-7 just hours after Jake's arrival. Representatives from 47 species filled the elegant amphitheater, their diverse forms creating a living testament to the diversity of galactic life. The tension in the room was palpable despite the chamber's serene architecture. Lyra Ah stood at the center podium, her usual composure strained by the weight of the crisis. Around her, beings that had never dreamed of having a voice in galactic affairs now faced the possibility of annihilation for daring to believe in something better. Friends, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber through advanced translation systems, we faced the greatest challenge in our short history as a cooperative. Commander Morrison brings word from the human government. Jake rose from his seat in the observer section, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes focused on him. Many of these beings had committed everything to the vision of cooperative civilization based largely on humanity's initial gesture of support. Now he had to tell them that support was uncertain. The Human Defense Council is convening an emergency session of our Colonial Congress, he explained. Every human world will be represented in the decision of whether to formally support the cooperative networks. A ripple of sound passed through the assembly, hisses, clicks, harmonic tones, and other expressions of distress from species that communicated in ways human ears couldn't detect. How long? Asked Zephin Cartel, the crystalline representative from the harmonic worlds. Her voice resonated with overtones that suggested barely controlled anxiety. 48 to 72 hours, Jake replied. Emergency protocols allow for expedited debate, but the hegemony fleets will not wait for human political processes, interrupted Thorn Metal Weaver, whose silicon-based physiology made him look like a living statue. Our intelligence networks report massive military buildups on 3 fronts. Lyra activated the chamber's central holographic display, showing real-time intelligence gathered by the cooperative surprisingly effective information network. Red indicators marked hostile fleet positions, while blue showed cooperative facilities and allied territories. The situation is deteriorating rapidly, she confirmed. Our sources indicate coordinated planning among the major powers. They're no longer treating us as a minor irritation to be managed. We've become a threat they intend to eliminate. Then, we fight, declared Commander Vextar, not to be confused with the hegemony's chancellor. This was a military leader from the Iron Coast Collective. My people have been preparing defensive systems throughout our territories. We won't simply wait to be slaughtered. With what? Thorne's question resonated with metallic overtones of skepticism. Our combined military forces might delay their advance by days, perhaps weeks. We cannot match the firepower of multiple major powers. We don't need to match their firepower, said a new voice from the gallery. Jake turned to see a being he didn't recognize, tall, ethereal, with skin that seemed to shift between translucent and opaque. We need to deny them the quick victory they're counting on. Lyra gestured toward the newcomer. Friends, this is Admiral Whispergene of the Voidwalker fleet. Her people have remained neutral in galactic politics for centuries, but recent events have concerned them. Admiral Whispergene moved to the center of the chamber with flowing motions that seemed to defy gravity. The Voidwalkers have watched the major powers consolidate control for longer than most species have existed. We chose isolation rather than resistance because we believed the cost of opposition was too high. She manipulated the holographic display to show historical galactic maps spanning millennia. But, we have seen this pattern before. Each generation of major powers grows more oppressive than the last. Each cycle of consolidation eliminates more diversity, more potential, more hope. What are you proposing? Jake asked. That perhaps the cost of opposition has become less than the cost of continued isolation. The Admiral's form seemed to solidify as she spoke, becoming more present and definite. The Voidwalker fleet numbers over 300 vessels. We have technologies the major powers have never encountered. And, we have allies they do not suspect. The chamber erupted in excited discussion. The Voidwalkers were legends, a species so advanced and elusive that many believed them to be myths. Their sudden appearance changed the strategic calculation entirely. But, Lyra raised her hand for silence. Admiral Whispergene's offer is generous beyond measure. But, we must consider what we're truly contemplating. If we fight, we're not just defending our current facilities. We're committing to a galactic war that could last decades and cost millions of lives. And, if we don't fight, asked Zephin Cartel. If we submit to the major powers' demands and dissolve our networks, then, we return to the universe as it was, Thorne replied grimly. Where the strong prey upon the weak, and cooperation exists only when it serves the interests of those in power. Jake listened to the debate with growing understanding of the impossible choice the cooperative faced. Surrender meant the death of everything they had built, but resistance meant risking the death of everyone who had built it. There is another option, he said suddenly. The chamber fell quiet as all attention focused on him. What if we forced the major powers to show their true nature to the entire galaxy? Lyra studied his face carefully. Explain. Jake moved to the holographic display and began manipulating the tactical information. The major powers maintain legitimacy by claiming their dominance serves galactic stability. They position themselves as protectors of civilization against chaos and conflict. But, if they attack peaceful research facilities and cooperative networks, they reveal themselves as aggressors, Admiral Whispergene finished. Interesting. But, public opinion means little when backed by overwhelming military force. Unless public opinion is backed by something else, Jake replied. He activated new data streams showing communication networks throughout the galaxy. How many species are watching what happens here? How many are deciding whether cooperation is possible or whether they need to submit completely to the established order? Thorn's form seemed to vibrate with excitement. If we can demonstrate that the cooperative model works under pressure, that it can defend itself and its principles, we create a template other species can follow, Zephin concluded. Even if we lose, we prove that resistance is possible. And, if we win, Lyra added quietly, we prove that cooperation can be stronger than domination. Admiral Whispergene studied the assembled representatives. This plan requires perfect coordination and absolute commitment. One species breaking ranks, one facility surrendering without authorization, and the entire strategy collapses. It also requires humanity to make its choice quickly, Jake added. If the Colonial Congress decides against support while we're in the middle of a defensive action, then, we discover whether our principles are worth defending regardless of outside support, Lyra said firmly. The debate continued for hours as representatives wrestled with the implications of their choice. Species that had survived millennia by avoiding conflict were being asked to risk everything for an untested ideal. But, gradually, consensus began to emerge. Commander Vextar spoke for many when he declared, "My people have been under the boot of major powers for 6 generations. If there's even a chance to break free of that cycle, isn't it worth the risk?" Others echoed similar sentiments. The singing crystals of Harmony had watched their unique technologies be stolen and commercialized by the Hegemony Alliance. The reef tenders had seen their aquatic world stripped of resources by Krog mining operations. The cloud dancers had been forced from their atmospheric territories by ethereal expansion. Each species had grievances, but, more importantly, each had experienced something unprecedented in the past 6 months, hope. "Very well," Lyra said as the formal vote concluded. "We proceed with the restoration project announcement as planned. Admiral Whispergene, your fleet will coordinate with our defense forces. All research facilities will implement emergency protocols while maintaining their cooperative activities." She turned to Jake. "Commander, will you carry a message to your government?" "Of course. Tell them that the Hydron Cooperative and our allies have chosen to trust in the principles humanity demonstrated at Nexus Prime. Tell them that we believe in the possibility of a galaxy where strength serves justice rather than conquest. And, tell them that regardless of their decision, we will not betray those principles by abandoning them when they become inconvenient." Jake felt the weight of that message settle on his shoulders. It was both an affirmation of faith and a challenge, a statement that the Hydrons would hold themselves to the standards they believed humanity represented, regardless of whether humanity chose to hold itself to those same standards. As the assembly dispersed to prepare for what might be their final days, Jake found himself alone with Lyra in the chamber. The holographic displays still showed the approaching threat, red indicators growing closer by the hour. "Do you really think we can survive this?" he asked. "Survival was never the only consideration, Commander," she replied. "Sometimes the way you fight matters more than whether you win. That's a noble sentiment, but dead martyrs don't build cooperative civilizations." Lyra smiled, and, for a moment Jake saw the frightened observer from Nexus Prime superimposed over the confident leader she had become. Perhaps not. But, they inspire others to try again. And, again. Until eventually, someone succeeds. She activated one final display showing a different kind of map, communication networks reaching throughout the galaxy. Thousands of species, many unknown to the major powers, were monitoring events around Kepler 7. Some were isolated primitives just discovering space travel. Others were advanced civilizations hiding in distant systems. But, all were watching. "Whatever happens here will echo across the galaxy for generations," Lyra said. "Species will remember that cooperation was tried, that it was possible, that ordinary beings could choose to help each other rather than exploit each other. That memory might be enough to change everything." Jake studied the scope of the networks, the sheer number of civilizations that might be influenced by what happened in the next few days. The Hydrons had built something far more significant than even he had realized, not just cooperative research facilities, but a galactic-scale demonstration that different choices were possible. "I should get back to Luna Station," he said finally. "The congressional debate will begin soon." "Go," Lyra agreed. "Help your people understand what they're truly choosing between. Not just military alliance or political expedience, but the kind of galaxy they want their children to inherit." As Jake prepared to leave Kepler-7, he carried with him the knowledge that humanity's choice would determine far more than their own future. They were choosing whether the galaxy would slide toward permanent tyranny or take its first steps toward something that had never existed on such a scale, a truly cooperative interstellar civilization. The next 72 hours would determine which vision would survive to shape the future of thousands of species across millions of worlds. And, somewhere in the void between star systems, battle fleets moved closer to their targets, preparing to enforce the galaxy's oldest law, that might makes right, and cooperation is a luxury the universe cannot afford. The emergency session of the Human Colonial Congress had been in session for 36 hours when the first reports arrived from Kepler-7. Representative Sarah Chen of the Mars colony was in the middle of a passionate speech about humanity's moral obligations when her aide rushed onto the floor with a priority communication. "Madam Speaker," Chen called out, her voice cutting through the debate, "I've just received word that the Hydron Restoration Project has gone public. They've announced the formation of a galaxy-wide cooperative network spanning over 200 star systems." The massive assembly hall fell silent. 800 representatives from across human space stopped their debates and side conversations to focus on the implications of that announcement. Jake Morrison watched from the observer gallery as Speaker Williams called for the communication to be broadcast to the entire assembly. Lyra's image appeared on the chamber's main display, standing in what appeared to be a vast coordination center filled with beings from dozens of species working together. "Citizens of the galaxy," Lyra began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was announcing. 6 months ago, humanity demonstrated that it was possible for a strong species to choose cooperation over domination. Today, we expand that demonstration to its logical conclusion. The display shifted to show a three-dimensional map of the galaxy with hundreds of blue lights indicating cooperative facilities and allied territories. Jake heard gasps from the congressional representatives as they realized the true scope of what had been accomplished. "The Restoration Project represents more than research stations or trade agreements," Lyra continued. "It represents a fundamental choice about what kind of galaxy we want to inhabit. We choose cooperation over exploitation. We choose mutual aid over mutual destruction. We choose hope over fear." As if on cue, Representative Marcus Webb of the Titan colony jumped to his feet. "This is exactly what I warned about. The Hydrons have used our resources to build a galactic conspiracy against the established order. It's not a conspiracy if they announce it publicly," Representative Chin shot back. "This is exactly what they said they would do, create alternatives to the cycle of domination and subjugation." The debate erupted across the chamber as representatives argued over the implications of the Hydron announcement. But, Jake's attention was focused on a separate display showing military intelligence updates. The moment Lyra's broadcast ended, the anticipated response had begun. Hegemony Alliance battle fleets were moving toward cooperative territories on 6 different fronts. The Krog Federation had declared the Hydron networks to be pirate organizations threatening legitimate trade routes. Even the normally neutral ethereal conclave was mobilizing forces to restore order to destabilized regions. Admiral Chen, Jake's former commander, appeared on another communication channel with an urgent message for the congressional leadership. "Madam Speaker, we're detecting massive military movements throughout the galaxy. Conservative estimates suggest the combined attack force numbers over 2,000 vessels. The cooperative networks are about to face annihilation." The weight of that statement settled over the assembly like a physical force. 2,000 vessels represented more firepower than most species had ever seen in one place. It was a force designed not just to defeat the cooperative networks, but to obliterate them so completely that no other species would ever consider following their example. Representative Williams called for order as the debate intensified. The question before this assembly, she announced, is no longer whether to support the Hydron networks. The question is whether we stand by and watch them be destroyed, or whether we act on the principles that led us to elevate them in the first place. Jake found himself on his feet before he realized he was moving. "Madam Speaker, I request permission to address the assembly." A murmur ran through the chamber. Jake was technically a military observer, not a representative, but his role in initiating the current crisis gave him a unique perspective. "Permission granted, Commander Morrison." Jake made his way to the central podium, acutely aware of 800 pairs of eyes watching his every move. These people would decide whether humanity honored its principles or abandoned them when the cost became clear. "Representatives," he began, "6 months ago, I made a choice that has led to this moment. I chose to give our compensation at Nexus Prime to a species that had been ignored and forgotten. I want to explain why I made that choice, and why I believe we must make a similar choice today." He activated the chamber's display system to show footage from human history, battles against tyranny, moments when ordinary people chose to stand up for principles rather than accept oppression. "Throughout our history, humanity has faced a recurring choice," Jake said. "We could accept the world as it was, or we could fight to make it what it should be. We fought against slavery, against totalitarianism, against every system that claimed some beings were naturally superior to others." Representative Webb interrupted. "But those were human conflicts, fought for human freedom. This is different." "Is it?" Jake challenged. "The principle is identical. Powerful groups claiming the right to dominate weaker ones based on nothing more than their ability to do so. The scale is larger, but the moral question is the same." He changed the display to show recent footage from cooperative facilities, beings from different species working together, sharing knowledge, building something greater than any of them could achieve alone. The Hydrons have proven that cooperation can work on a galactic scale. They've shown that species don't have to choose between strength and justice, between security and principles. But proving that cooperation is possible isn't enough. They have to prove it can survive when challenged by those who prefer the old ways. "And if we support them and lose?" asked Representative Martinez from the Jupiter colonies. "If we sacrifice human lives for an idealistic experiment that fails?" Jake paused, considering the question that cut to the heart of the entire debate. "Then, we'll have proven that humanity stands for something more than its own advancement. We'll have shown the galaxy that at least one species was willing to risk everything for the principle that all sapient beings deserve the chance to determine their own destiny." Representative Chen stood. "Commander, what do you believe the consequences will be if we don't act?" "Complete consolidation of galactic power under the major empires," Jake replied without hesitation. "Within our lifetimes, there will be 3 or 4 species controlling everything, with all others serving as client races or facing extinction. Humanity might be powerful enough to secure a position among the rulers, but our children will inherit a galaxy where cooperation is impossible and justice exists only at the pleasure of the strong." The chamber fell quiet as representatives considered the implications. Finally, Speaker Williams called for formal statements from the various faction leaders. Representative Webb spoke for the isolationist coalition. "Humanity has fought hard to secure its position in the galaxy. We cannot risk everything we've built for an uncertain ideal. The Hydron networks, admirable as they may be, cannot survive against the combined might of the major powers. Supporting them means condemning our own people to a war we cannot win." Representative Chen responded for the Interventionist Alliance. "Humanity's position in the galaxy means nothing if we abandon the principles that make us who we are. The major powers fear the cooperative networks precisely because they prove that alternatives to domination are possible. If we fail to defend that possibility now, we'll never get another chance." The debate continued for hours as representatives wrestled with the most consequential decision in human history. Meanwhile, Jake watched the tactical displays showing the approaching fleets. Time was running out for the cooperative networks, and, by extension, for humanity's choice to matter. Finally, Speaker Williams called for the vote. The question before the Assembly: shall humanity commit military forces to defend the Hydron cooperative networks and their allies, knowing that such action may result in war with multiple major powers? The voting was conducted by electronic ballot to ensure accuracy and prevent outside influence. As the votes were tallied, Jake found himself holding his breath despite knowing that his opinion carried no formal weight. The results appeared on the main display: 421 in favor, 376 opposed, 3 abstentions. Humanity had chosen to stand with the cooperatives. The chamber erupted in a mixture of cheers and protests as representatives reacted to the narrow victory. But, Speaker Williams was already activating emergency communication channels to relay orders to the human defense fleet. "Admiral Chen," she said as the military commander's image appeared on screen, "you are authorized to deploy all available forces to defend cooperative facilities and territories. Rules of engagement are defensive only unless directly attacked, but you have full discretion to interpret threats to cooperative civilians." "Understood, Madam Speaker." Fleet deployment begins immediately. As the congressional session adjourned and representatives rushed to return to their home worlds, Jake found himself alone with Speaker Williams in her private office. Through the transparent aluminum windows, he could see the lights of human ships beginning to move toward jump points that would take them across the galaxy. "Do you think we made the right choice, Commander?" Williams asked. Jake considered the question, thinking about Lyra and the thousands of beings who had committed everything to the idea that cooperation was possible, about the fleets moving to attack them, about the human ships now moving to defend them. "I think we made the only choice consistent with who we claim to be," he said finally. "Whether it's right, we'll find out soon enough." The first battle reports began arriving 6 hours later. The Hegemony Alliance had struck simultaneously at 12 cooperative facilities, expecting quick victories against defenseless research stations. Instead, they found coordinated resistance from species they had written off as irrelevant, backed by technologies they didn't recognize and tactical doctrines they couldn't predict. The Void Walker fleet appeared without warning in 3 different systems, their advanced vessels tearing through hegemony formations with weapons that seemed to bend space itself. The defensive networks the Iron Coast Collective had built proved surprisingly effective against Krog assault tactics. And, throughout it all, the cooperative species fought with a desperation born of knowing that defeat meant the end of everything they had built. Most importantly, they fought together. Species that had never coordinated military action before shared targeting data, provided mutual support, and adapted their tactics in real time. The coordination was imperfect, but it was unprecedented. When the human defense fleet arrived at the first battle zones, they found not the massacre everyone had expected, but a genuine fight. The cooperatives were holding their own, barely, but their resistance was proving that they were more than the helpless victims the major powers had assumed. Jake watched the battle reports with a mixture of pride and terror. The cooperatives were proving that cooperation could survive under pressure, but the cost was enormous. Ships were being destroyed, facilities were being damaged, and beings were dying for the principle that the galaxy could be better than it was. But they were also proving something else, that when pushed to the breaking point, the oppressed could choose to stand together rather than fall separately. The first phase of what would later be called the Restoration War had begun, and, with it, the galaxy's first real chance to discover whether cooperation could be stronger than conquest. 3 days after the congressional vote, Jake received a personal message from Lyra. Her image appeared in his quarters aboard the command ship Defiance, her face showing exhaustion but also something he had never seen there before, hope. "Commander Morrison," she said, "I wanted you to know that 17 more species have joined the cooperative network since the fighting began. Species that had remained neutral are choosing sides based on what they see happening here. We are proving that another way is possible." She paused, and, when she continued, her voice carried absolute conviction. "Whatever the cost, whatever the outcome, we have already won the most important victory. We have shown the galaxy that cooperation is not weakness, that justice is not naivety, that beings can choose to help each other rather than exploit each other. That knowledge can never be destroyed, even if we are. As Jake prepared for his own deployment to the front lines, he carried that message with him. Humanity had chosen to stand for something greater than its own advancement. Whether they would survive that choice remained to be seen, but they had made it clear to the entire galaxy that some principles were worth risking everything to defend. The age of cooperative civilization had begun, born in the fires of war but sustained by the hope that the galaxy could be better than it was. And, at its heart lay the simple truth that a human soldier had discovered 6 months earlier: sometimes the greatest strength comes not from what you can take, but from what you choose to give.